I was 63 when I first met him. Julian. He had the kind of smile that made you forget your age, your place in the world, and even your dignity. My name is Margaret Bloomfield. I come from what most people would call an established family. My husband, Harold, is, or rather was, a real estate magnate with enough money to fund 3 lifetimes. We had the mansions, the art, the private dinners with senators and CEOs. To everyone looking in, I was the epitome of a woman who had it all. But here's the part no one ever talks about. Even golden cages are cages. My days had become a rotation of charity galas, hollow conversations, and being someone's wife instead of someone. I met Julian at a contemporary art gallery in Santa Monica. He was standing in front of a giant, chaotic splash of red and black paint and said something witty about how it looked like a divorce in motion. I laughed, genuinely laughed, for the first time in months. He told me he was 21, studying graphic design and working part-time as a barista. He didn't know who I was. Not really. And that thrilled me. Started with coffee dates. Then lunches. Then long walks through Venice Beach where I left my pearls behind and wore sneakers and sunglasses like a woman escaping her own life. He listened to me. Touched my hand like it was sacred. Told me I was radiant. Didn't take long for my heart to forget logic. I moved out of the estate and into a penthouse condo I bought on impulse overlooking the ocean. I told Harold I needed space to think. But in truth, I had already decided. I wanted Julian. He didn't ask me for money at first. That came later. Started small. I don't have a suit for your fundraiser. So I bought him one. Hugo Boss. Then it was, my car is falling apart and I'm always late to class. I gave him a Tesla. By the time I put a down payment on a 2-bedroom apartment in downtown Los Angeles in his name, I told myself it was an investment in our future. Love makes fools of the smartest people. I was no exception. Calls became less frequent. He stopped complimenting me. Nights once filled with laughter turned into silence and scrolling on his phone. When I asked if something was wrong, he'd sigh and say I was overthinking everything. Then came the requests. A music studio set up. A trip to Europe for inspiration. Help with a startup idea that never made it past the expensive website design phase. I saw the credit card bills stacking up. My financial advisor warned me gently, "You're withdrawing more than usual, Mrs. Bloomfield." Till I defended him. He's young. He's just finding his way. The final straw was when I found a receipt for a luxury watch I didn't buy. When I confronted him, he shrugged and said, "You weren't using the account anyway." That night, he didn't come home. Weeks passed. No texts. No calls. Just silence. When I finally visited the apartment I bought him, he wasn't there. A neighbor told me he had moved out last week with a girl named Carly. I stood in the empty hallway staring at the door like it would suddenly open and make all of this make sense. But it didn't. Because it couldn't. I had been used. It wasn't just the money. It was the way he made me feel seen, like I mattered. And then discarded me like something expired. I thought about calling Harold. But I was ashamed. Took me 3 tries before I actually rang the doorbell of the house we used to share. My hands were trembling. I had rehearsed my apology in the car a dozen times. Harold answered the door. His eyes were the same pale blue I had memorized over decades. But they didn't soften when he saw me. "I just wanted to talk," I said quietly. He didn't invite me in. He stood there, silent. "I made a mistake," I said. "I know," he replied. A long pause. I hoped he would ask me to sit. Ask me to explain. But he didn't. "I loved you," I whispered. "I still do." He nodded once. "I loved you too. But I don't anymore." And then the door closed. After Harold closed the door, I drove aimlessly for hours, winding through roads I used to know by heart. Eventually, I returned to the penthouse, but it no longer felt like mine. The floor-to-ceiling windows showed me the same ocean, but the view was hollow now. Everything reminded me of him, of both of them honestly. The designer shoes kicked off at the door. Paintings Julian helped me choose. The ridiculous velvet couch I once thought looked fun and daring. None of it mattered anymore. I turned off the lights and sat in silence for the first time in months. No phones ringing. No footsteps echoing through the hall. Just the quiet sound of my own disappointment filling every inch of space. Wealth attracts attention. But once your shine dulls, the crowd thins. When Harold and I were together, I was never short of lunch invitations or gala invites. But after leaving him, those calls slowed. And after Julian left me, they stopped altogether. The wives in my circle whispered behind wine glasses. A 63-year-old woman running off with a boy young enough to be her grandson? It was scandalous enough to entertain, but not respectable enough to support. Even my closest friend Linda didn't answer my last 2 calls. I wasn't surprised. She was always more loyal to Harold. There's something profoundly lonely about realizing people cared more about your position than your person. One afternoon, I took a detour and ended up near the neighborhood where Harold and I raised our children. I parked across from the old house, our first real home. It was smaller than I remembered, with peeling shutters and a dent in the mailbox that Harold never got around to fixing. I remembered the birthday parties in the backyard. Christmas lights we'd struggle to untangle each year. The time we danced barefoot in the kitchen after too much wine. And suddenly I missed him, not just as a husband but as my history. We didn't have a perfect marriage. But we built a life. Brick by brick, year by year. And I left it all for what? Compliments and compliments that faded when the credit card stopped working? I sat down that night and wrote a letter to Harold. Not to win him back. Not even to apologize in full. Just to say what I hadn't been brave enough to say at his door. Harold, I thought I wanted excitement. I thought I wanted to feel young again. But what I really wanted was to feel loved. I forgot that I already was. I'm sorry I couldn't see it then. And I understand why you won't see me now. But I loved our life. I truly did. Margaret. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. I never mailed it. Some things are better left unsaid, especially when they're 10 steps too late. The next few weeks passed slowly. I sold the apartment Julian once lived in. Donated most of the clothes I bought him. I even canceled the music subscription he used to play in the car. Little by little, I erased his presence from my life. But not the lesson. I started volunteering at a local community center, not to fill a void but to feel useful again. To be seen by people who didn't care about my bank account or my last name. There was an older woman there named Doris, 78, who ran the kitchen like a general. She didn't care about my history. She just handed me a ladle and said, "Make yourself useful, darling." And for the first time in months, I felt like I belonged somewhere. I used to avoid mirrors. Not because I was ashamed of aging, but because I hated what guilt looked like on my face. But one evening, after a particularly long shift at the center, I caught my reflection and paused. The woman staring back at me had more wrinkles. Her eyes had learned regret. But they had also remembered strength. I had been foolish. Yes, I had let flattery blind me. I had walked away from a man who, in his own quiet way, had loved me deeply. But I had also survived. And survival meant something. It had been nearly a year since Julian vanished from my life when I saw him again, unexpectedly, in a Whole Foods parking lot in West Hollywood. He was loading groceries into the back of a used hatchback. No luxury car. No designer clothes. He looked normal. Older, somehow, though he was only in his early 20s. For a moment, I wanted to turn around and walk away. But he saw me first. His smile was nervous. "Margaret," he said, almost like a question. I nodded. Julian. There was an awkward pause between us, like two actors who forgot their lines in the middle of a play. How are you? He asked, scratching the back of his neck. I'm healing, I said honestly. He looked down. I never meant to hurt you. I didn't say anything. He added, I wasn't ready for the kind of love you gave. That was the truest thing he'd ever said to me. We said goodbye like two people who once pretended the world belonged to them and now knew better. Months later, I received an envelope with Harold's handwriting. It wasn't a letter, just a short note written in his blunt, careful script. Margaret, I read your letter. I believe you meant every word. But some broken things don't need fixing. I wish you peace. Harold, I cried. Not because I hoped for reconciliation, but because I finally understood. Forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same thing. Sometimes people forgive you silently from afar because they've decided to move on without hate. But that doesn't mean they want you back in their life. And that's fair. Time moved forward, as it always does. I stayed in Santa Monica, but I downsized to a modest bungalow with a rose garden. I spent mornings drinking coffee by the window and afternoons volunteering. The people at the center called me Miss Maggie. They didn't know I used to dine with governors or wear gowns that cost more than their cars. And I didn't need them to know. One evening, a young woman at the center asked me, "Were you ever in love?" I smiled. "Yes. Twice," I said. Once with a man who gave me everything without ever raising his voice. And once with a boy who taught me how foolish I could be. She laughed, thinking it was a joke. But it wasn't. Looking back now, I don't hate Julian. He didn't steal from me. I gave. Willingly. Recklessly. 'Cause I was starved for something I thought I'd lost forever. And I don't blame Harold for not taking me back. In fact, I respect him more for that choice. This story isn't about villains. It's about loneliness, and how even the richest woman in the world can fall into it without warning. If I could go back, would I change things? Yes, but maybe not all of them. 'Cause pain taught me humility. Loss reminded me what real love looks like. And now, in my quiet little house with roses blooming out front and soup simmering on the stove, I feel whole again. Not because I was saved, but because I stopped looking for someone else to fill my empty places.